From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Division. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm really delighted to see you all here today. I'm also extremely happy to welcome Kyrgyz Ambassador Kadir Toktogulov to the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. He has been here several times before. However, today he's here in an official capacity to present a short documentary on Chingiz Aitmatov, the most important Kyrgyz author of the 20th century. Ambassador Toktogulov was the person who originally introduced us to today's speaker, Geoffrey Lilly, but in fact, we had met earlier, 10 years ago, when we first held a major conference on Chingiz Aitmatov. And he was there, and he told me that he was there, and he had just started writing his book. And today, we're having Geoffrey Lilly with the book completed and ready to share with everyone here and across the world, because, as you know, we're being webcast, and therefore this program is going to appear around the world. And the book, with the wonderful title, Have the Mountains Fallen? It's an intriguing title. I want to hear more about it. Will be on sale after this program. Now, a few words about Ambassador Kadir Toktogulov. On December 31st, 2014, Kyrgyzstan's president, Almazbek Atambayev, appointed him as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Kyrgyz Republic to the United States of America. And 2 months later, on February 23, 2015, he presented his credentials to President Barack Obama and took office. However, that was not all. The following year, on February 24, 2016, Kadir Toktogulov was again appointed by President Almazbek Atambayev as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to Canada this time. But as he could not divide himself into two, his residence is officially in Washington, D.C. So he presented his credentials to the Governor General of Canada, David Johnston, on March 22, 2016. We are thus very honored today to have with us two ambassadors in one person. So we are delighted to welcome him here. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, Kadir Toktogulov served as President Atambayev's press secretary, having worked earlier as the chief of information policy in the office of the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan. There, he was in charge of coordinating media relations for the Prime Minister, his deputies, and key government officials. He also coordinated media coverage of the work of the government. Ambassador Kadir Toktogulov is also a very experienced journalist, having worked as a correspondent for the Associated Press between 2003 and 2006, the Dow Jones Newswires, as well as having contributed a number of stories for the Wall Street Journal between 2006 and 2011. He holds a BA degree in journalism and mass communications from the American University of Central Asia, Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and was an exchange student at Ankara University, Ankara, Turkey, 1998 and 1999, and also at Ithaca College between 2001 and 2002 here in New York. So in addition to Kyrgyz, he's fluent in Russian, English, and Turkish. And now let us all welcome the ambassador, who will introduce the film for today.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb. Dear friends, it's wonderful to see you all today at the book launch of the newly released book by my friend Geoffrey Lilly. We've spoken earlier today to figure out what year we actually met in Kyrgyzstan, and that was we figured out that it was 2005 in Bishkek. But before I speak about today's event and the book and the author, Geoffrey Lilly, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to the Library of Congress. It's a very special institution that holds a unique importance for the United States and the world libraries. Special thanks to the African and Middle Eastern Division, Chief of the Division, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, and John Weeks, Head Near East Section and Turkish Specialist. Thank you very much for hosting today's event. My embassy colleagues and I have enjoyed working with you on putting together this book presentation. I especially enjoyed our conversations about the vast collection of Central Asian literature that the library holds. And the best moments of our discussions were talking about my home country, Kyrgyzstan, and our most famous writer, the late Chingiz Aitmatov. I'm grateful to the library and to you, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb and Joan Weeks, for agreeing to host the presentation of this fascinating book, Have the Mountains Fallen? You told me you liked the title of the book back then when we were discussing the details of today's event, and I really like it too. I was a journalist when Jeff and I met. He was working in Bishkek as the country director of the International Republican Institute in Bishkek office. He recently returned to Kyrgyzstan to continue his support for my country and my country's democratic development. The book is really fascinating. It's my country's journey to independence through the stories of its two outstanding sons that had lived through Kyrgyz nation's tragedies in the 20th century before the country declared its independence in 1991. I am very happy that this event is taking place as we celebrate the 90th birthday of our great writer Chingiz Aitmatov. His books and stories put Kyrgyzstan on the map for many people around the world and helped my country stand firmer in today's world. I have personal stories about the two heroes of the book that I'd like to share with you. Chingiz Aitmatov is my favorite writer. His books kept me awake at nights as I was reading his stories about lives of his characters during and after the World War II in Kyrgyzstan. I was happy when I got to see him in Ankara at a conference when I was a student. I even managed to get an autograph in a book by him that I was reading at the time. He was a great master in how he told the story of my country and people during difficult days, which tested human beings' courage, decency, kindness, generosity, and love for the country. The importance of Chingiz Aitmatov to the Kyrgyz Republic and the Kyrgyz people is significant. Nobody has made a stronger contribution to today's Kyrgyzstan self-identity than Aitmatov. This year, we're celebrating the 90th birthday of our great writer, and we see this book launch as part of the celebrations. When I was here in the US 2001-2002, I attempted to meet Azamat Altai. I was very much fascinated by his personal story of his journey all the way from Kyrgyzstan to the US through the horrors of World War II and challenges of his life in Europe. Through some Kyrgyz contacts, I managed to get hold of his home phone number and dial him. Azamat Altai picked up the phone, and when I spoke to him in Kyrgyz and told him that I wanted to visit him, he gave me his home address. But back then, there were no smartphones that would guide you through a city that you don't know, or I couldn't get any tips on how to get to Flushing Meadows. I was in New York for a couple of days only, so I failed to visit him. And to be honest, I regret not having made the efforts back then to see this great man. Jeff, you did a great job in telling the intertwining stories of Chingiz Aitmatov and Azamat Altai. And through their stories, you told the story of my country. You really took us through the days of the Urkun, the great tragedy, and the flight of the Kyrgyz people to China during their violent crackdown by the Tsarist Russian troops. You took us through the tragic years of the World War II. And in your book, you took us through my country's journey to independence. It's an emotional book, and it's an important book if one wants to learn about the Kyrgyz Republic and its best representatives. Chingiz Aitmatov and Azamat Altai are among them. As ambassador of an independent Kyrgyzstan, I'd like to say thank you for the book, for your hard work writing this book, and your respect and love for my country, my country's peoples and heroes. Thank you, Jeff. I really look forward to the presentation. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Venera Jumatayeva, Director of Kyrgyz Service of RFARL, who came all the way from Prague for this event and also helped us with the presentation by producing this video that we'll see, that will introduce the heroes of the book that Jeff wrote before his presentation. Thank you.
Two Kyrgyz men whose lives were adversely affected and forever changed by the biggest tragedies of the 20th century, Chingiz Aitmatov and Azamat Altai. Two people whose lives reflect all the political and moral lessons of the century. Chingiz Aitmatov, the most famous Kyrgyz writer, lost his father to Stalin's repressive regime in 1938 and only found where his father had been executed and buried 53 years after it occurred. Not only his father, a promising young Kyrgyz leader, but several of his uncles also fell victim to the Soviet dictatorship. Aitmatov hid his deep inner sadness after losing his father at the age of 9 and dedicated his life to educating himself and his 3 younger siblings. He became an internationally known author whose books, which have been translated into more than 160 languages, describe the national character, lifestyle, and existential philosophy of the nomadic Kyrgyz people. In every book, Aitmatov created a hero who, in whatever difficult circumstances he or she was forced to live, would choose to live freely, happily, and fully.
Если человек перестанет думать о жизни и смерти, если он перестанет метаться между этими двумя полюсами бытия, то он, наверное, перестанет быть человеком. Каждый, любой человек думает, и ему предстоит думать о том, что такое жизнь и что такое смерть. Это неизбежно. Это обязательная, я бы сказал, доля всякого мыслящего существа. Столкнуться задолго до наступления самой смерти с мыслями о ней. И эти мысли, на мой взгляд, они, наверное, и оттачивали, совершенствовали человеческое в человеке. Если бы не было понимания смерти, то не было бы, наверное, и понимания сути жизни.
The Kyrgyz author was a supporter of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and advised him on the implementation of the very first political reforms in the final years of the USSR. He was later appointed Soviet ambassador to Luxembourg and then was Kyrgyzstan's ambassador to the Benelux countries, spending the last 18 years of his life in Europe, mostly Brussels. Even after his death, Aitmatov's books and their heroes continued to introduce Kyrgyzstan as a beautiful, mountainous country and its people's rich character and values to the entire world. Azamat Altai, a young and educated Kyrgyz man, decided to stay in the West after World War II after realizing that he would be punished in the USSR since serving as a POW in a Nazi camp. That decision cut him off from his homeland, from his father and other relatives, for 55 years. Eager to make a connection with his homeland, Altai made contacts with other Russian and Soviet dissidents living in Europe and attended several gatherings of Central Asian and Soviet dissidents, even writing articles for dissident publications. He was later appointed an editor of the Turkeli magazine, published by Central Asian dissidents in Europe. Through those connections, Azamat Altai became Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty's very first Kyrgyz broadcaster in March 1953. In his work, Altai had to cover many taboo topics in Soviet Kyrgyzstan, such as victims of Stalin's repression, young Kyrgyz writers, intellectuals, poets, and politicians whose names, let alone their works, were forbidden in the Kyrgyz media at the time. Altai, and later his new Kyrgyz colleagues at RFERL, covered issues regarding the Kyrgyz diaspora living in Afghanistan, Turkey, and Pakistan. RFERL's Kyrgyz service also paid a lot of attention in the early years to Kyrgyz language, customs, and history issues in the ever-increasingly Russified Soviet Kyrgyzstan. Azamat Altai collected some 6,000 books and magazines on Kyrgyz and Central Asian topics at his home and had helped some prominent Western academics to conduct their research on Kyrgyzstan behind the Iron Curtain. He reported for RFERL's Kyrgyz service for some 40 years. Attacked regularly by the Soviet Kyrgyz media as a traitor and enemy of the people, Azamat Altai still had his secret supporters and admirers in Kyrgyzstan. Intellectuals, writers, and scholars would listen to RFERL Kyrgyz programs at their dachas, often built atop hills with better reception. And they would discuss Altai himself and RFERL Kyrgyz service programs among themselves. Some of the topics were related to the Soviet communist leadership and political corruption issues. That's why in 1995, when Altai, a retired veteran journalist and former RFERL Kyrgyz service director, was finally invited to independent Kyrgyzstan and arrived in the capital Bishkek, he was greeted as a national hero, as a Kyrgyz American who had devoted his life to the struggle for his people's freedom and independence, for Kyrgyz language, culture, and history.
Atatürk'e olan sağınıştı, Atatürk'ten azrağan adam bilir. Onsuz hiç kim düşünüş mümkün emez. Atatürk'tü men her zaman sağınıp geldim. Elimden jaman adatları olsa da, jakşı adatları olsa da men üçün ülgü edi. Onun için demek 40. yılı geçsem, 55 yıldan keyin 95. yılı Manastır'ın yıldığında varıp Kırgızistan'da gördüm.
Chingiz Aitmatov and Azamat Altai were born in Kyrgyzstan, but spent most of their lives on two different sides of the Cold War. Yet they were still able to meet several times during the Soviet era and again later in independent Kyrgyzstan. They had some important common goals in life: to find their lost fathers, to fight for their people's freedom, to preserve their national history, culture, and language, and to find justice and freedom in ordinary people's lives.
I turned from an automation person into this introduction. So on behalf of all my colleagues in the African and Middle Eastern Division, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone on this very special 90th birthday celebration for Chingiz Aitmatov. What a fantastic person. I mean, this movie just gave us a little snapshot, but I'm so pleased to be able to work with Ambassador Tukoful and the Embassy of Kyrgyzstan, and as head of the Near East section, the sponsor of today's program. We're very pleased to present this program. And we just are so delighted that Geoffrey came in and used the Library of Congress collections for his research. This is a fantastic division that combines all of Africa. We cover 78 countries and more than 24 languages, and we have all of these specialists here that will hope that you come in and use these wonderful collections for your research as well. We also invite you to cover and use our social media. We've got Facebook, we've got a blog, and you can hear about all our other programs as well. And just a slight note that this whole program is being videotaped for future broadcasts. So we welcome a couple questions perhaps at the end, but just to let you know that you giving permission to be videotaped if you do. And so I'd like to move right on without any further ado to the introduction of Jeff Lilly. He received his undergraduate degree in history and Russian from Williams College and a master's degree in Soviet studies from Johns Hopkins. And do you realize it was the last time they gave that degree because Soviet studies turned into studies of about all of the Central Asian countries. And he worked as a journalist in Russia, reporting for the Far Eastern Economic Review and Sports Illustrated, as well as Voice of America. And after witnessing the collapse of the Soviet Union as a journalist in the 1990s, he moved to Central Asia in 2004, where he began to work in the field of international democracy and governance in support of transitions in the countries of Eurasia and the Middle East. And during a three-year period as a posting in Kyrgyzstan from 2004 to 2007, he started reading the works of Chingiz Aitmatov. He slept in yurts, which I think is a fabulous opportunity to really get to know the country. He drank fermented mare's milk. I'm not sure I'd do that. He hiked in the country's beautiful mountains. And over the next 10 years, he worked in the field of democracy and governance support in Washington, D.C. and the Middle East. He continues his research and finished his book as well. In 2016, he returned to Kyrgyzstan to lead a British-funded parliamentary support program. He's also the author of China's Hands, 9 Decades of Adventure, Espionage, and Diplomacy. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jeff Lilly to the podium.
What a treat. I think it's my turn to say thank you to the Library of Congress. As Mary Jane has referred to, and Joan, I spent a good number of hours in this library, working with microfiche, working with books, and doing the research for this book, which was a labor of love, which, as was mentioned, took me 10 years to research and write. The Library of Congress is a treasure and a direct manifestation of American democracy. Thank you to those of you who work here to make your incredible holdings organized, and your building is organized, and available to writers like me. This is definitely a team effort. I was here 10 years ago when the Library of Congress put on a celebration that was supposed to mark Chingiz Aitmatov's 80th birthday, but instead it became a celebration of his life after he died in June 2008. That was a great event, with speakers from around the world, a speech by Dr. James Billington, a screening of the film Jamelia, and a display of Aitmatov's books in many languages, including Aramaic. You could say the event launched this book project, which now comes to a close right here, full circle. So on to the book. So I know everybody here knows where Kyrgyzstan is, and I know they know exactly how it's spelled. My father, who was a diplomat, was a little bit shaky on how to pronounce it. But anyway, this is a map of Kyrgyzstan, and I'll just point out here. Can you guys see my cursor? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shaker is where Chingiz Aitmatov was born in the west. And Koromdu, right here on the beautiful Lake Issyk, was where Azamat Altai was born. So these are two warriors for freedom from Kyrgyzstan, Chingiz Aitmatov and Azamat Altai. And it's a country, as was mentioned by Joan, that I first lived in from 2004 to 2007. Aitmatov was an intellectual warrior, and Altai was a battle-hardened warrior, literally, who carried the scars of war with him through life. Both were emboldened by their experiences to fight with words, one writing, one speaking, the good fight. So, as was mentioned, I arrived in 2004 and I started reading Aitmatov's body of work, short stories and novels written over 40 years during my posting, and I finished a couple of years later, that was just the reading, when working back in Washington, D.C. Had the Mountains Fallen is a story of the Cold War from the other side, with roots in the 1920s and 30s when Soviet power was establishing itself across the Eurasian landmass. It tells the parallel stories of Aitmatov and Altai, two men who travel separately through life until they meet and find common cause in, of all places, New York City in 1975. Their life stories are testaments to the human spirit's quest for freedom. Their lives are proof that lives live only for so long. That truth, as evidenced by the attainment of justice and redemption, is achievable, and that the search for a meaningful life is based on individual freedom. So, everybody's familiar with Kyrgyzstan, country descended from nomads, 90% mountains, and home to some of the most beautiful and pristine nature in the world. As you can see from the cover of the book, which is actually my wife's photo. My wife is a photographer, and she's here today. And we thought we could do better than Indiana University Press, which got a beautiful photo, but my wife's was better. So let's move on. Like so many other citizens, this is a picture of Turkul Aitmatov, Chingiz Aitmatov's father, and a young Chingiz when he was probably about 2 years old in 1930. Like so many other citizens at that time, Azamat Altai and Chingiz Aitmatov's father, pictured here, believed in Soviet power, which had brought literacy, electricity, hospitals, and schools to the Kyrgyz people. They served it loyally until Stalin's terror started to wreak havoc across the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The purges swept up Turkul Aitmatov in 1938. Train station, there's a very vivid scene in the book where Chingiz Aitmatov says goodbye to his father, not even knowing that he'll never see him again on the train station in Moscow. Those purges made a disbeliever out of Azamat Altai, and they shaped Chingiz Aitmatov's life. World War II was a crucible for both Altai and Chingiz Aitmatov. They were 8 years separated the men. Altai was born in 1920, Chingiz Aitmatov was born in 1928. So by the time World War II happened in the Soviet Union, they were both young men. As a 14-year-old in a village bereft of men because they had all been called to the front, Chingiz Aitmatov delivered death notices to families whose fathers, sons, or uncles had died in the war. So I want to read you a little passage from the book on that. So Chingiz Aitmatov has just delivered a death notice to a family. Chingiz would then stare at the ground, uncomfortable, 14 years old, shifting his feet. Usually he would hear a heavy sigh from the mother, then whimpering or heaving, and finally crying would rend the air like a plate shattering. Chingiz would stand there, a young boy with nowhere to run and no way to console. Villagers began associating the young village assistant with bad luck. As soon as households saw him riding down the street, they would shun him like an evil spirit. "Don't come to our house," they would say. "Pass by, don't bring us bad news." Such a young boy shouldering such heavy responsibilities. To suffer the village's grief as the messenger of bad news, a piece of paper in exchange for a son. But this was how Soviet society endured during World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as it is known in Russian. Ironies overwhelmed, the distant war wreaking havoc in an isolated village, teenagers running village affairs, and a boy not big enough to mount his horse, delivering death notices. Meanwhile, Soviet conscript Altai was scrambling for his life after being overrun by the German blitzkrieg in June 1941. He was serving in Soviet-occupied Lithuania at that point. Altai escaped from Nazi POW camps not once, not twice, but 3 times, eventually joining French freedom fighters on the march to liberate Paris. He dreamed of returning to his home village on Issyk-Kul, you saw that. But Soviet leader Stalin's perverse logic considered Soviet POWs as traitors just because they had the misfortune to be captured alive. That meant prison camp in Siberia for someone like Altai, even though he had crisscrossed Europe fighting for his own survival and always opposing the Nazis. It was absurd. Altai ended up making a decision which would irrevocably change his life. After midnight this is from the book, after midnight on January 1st, 1946, Altai was serving as a Soviet border guard then. As revelers in cities around Europe were raising their glasses to the end of World War II, Soviet border guard Azamat Altai tossed aside his rifle, threw off his military overcoat, and stole across the border into the English zone of recently liberated Germany. Altai headed south from the English zone in Germany. He was determined to get to France, the only country that had welcomed him and where he'd had friends from his partisan days. Using a smattering of French, German, and Russian, he begged a ticket off an elderly station worker at the Saarbrücken train station. Lacking permission to cross the still militarized German-French border, he stowed away, hiding in the first-class bathroom. Altai arrived in Paris a free but penniless man with not a French franc to his name. A passerby gave him 2 francs to ride on the subway. It was a humble start to a new life. But with each mile he traveled, on foot, by train or subway, he was leaving behind the tragedies of the past. In Europe after the war, Altai scrambled to make a living. He did manual labor in small towns in France. It was a lonely time with few friends among the rural French who had no idea where he came from. As a matter of fact, there's this little story in the book about Altai was so lonely that he got a dog. And he would put this dog in a cart, and then he would kind of wheel the cart, I guess, around the little village he was in, and he named the dog My Friend in Kyrgyz, which is Minin Dosum. And they called him, the French villagers called him the Chinese with a dog. That's the best they could get. Altai eventually educated himself anew, immersing himself in European philosophy and the struggle for independence of Soviet Central Asia. In 1953, as we saw in that wonderful film, he became the voice of Radio Liberty, broadcasting back into Soviet Kyrgyzstan. So it's 2 parallel stories, so I'm going to be jumping back and forth. Meanwhile, Aitmatov, scarred by the disappearance of his father, here's Aitmatov as a young man, you can see, I guess he's to his mother's left. And this is his brother Ilgiz, and this is his sister Rosa, who's still alive and well. And Ilgiz and Rosa are both alive and well in Bishkek in their 80s. And this is his sister Lucia behind him. So, scarred by the disappearance of his father in 1937, Aitmatov was keeping his head down, and as the eldest male in the family, 9 years old, trying to help his family survive. He was considered the son of an enemy of the people, denied his scholarship, refused his stipend, and denied entrance into graduate school despite stellar grades. He took to writing instead. He wrote stories of independent-minded, fallible people who on the outside may have been loyal Soviet citizens, but reading between the lines, his heroes bucked the system, whether it was patriarchal tradition, Soviet ideology, or groupthink. How Aitmatov did this under Soviet censorship is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. He contorted himself, hid behind the Kyrgyz language, which censors didn't understand, and compromised where and when necessary. As someone who knew him well told me when I was researching the book, when Chingiz Aitmatov got behind a desk, he couldn't lie. So he starts to break into fame and be famous in 1963, and his reputation, or his family's reputation, is resurrected when he wins the Lenin Prize in 1963 for a series of short stories, one of which was Jamelia, who I'm sure a lot of people in this room have read. Beautiful story. So here is a wonderful picture of Chingiz Aitmatov selling his books at a book fair, and you can see Jamelia right there in the background. It was a couple years after Jamelia came out. Just a neat picture that I found in the archives in Bishkek. So then Altai, fearful that Soviet spies would try to assassinate him for his radio work, Altai emigrated to the U.S., and he was one of the first Kyrgyz ever to do so. He settled in New York City, as Kader knows, in Flushing Meadows, right? A melting pot of nationalities and Cold War intrigues, and he started a 20-year career working in the New York Public Library and Columbia University Library. I think Altai would feel very at home at the Library of Congress. I'm sure he was here many times. So now it gets neat. You have these 2 parallel stories of men living, and what was fascinating to me is when I decided to incorporate Altai into the story, which is a couple of years after I had started researching Aitmatov's life, I found out the way their lives intersected. So far from home, cut off from his family and culture, Altai suffered immensely. He was a persona non grata, having been declared a traitor after jumping lines and sentenced to 25 years in jail should he ever return to the Soviet Union. His name was blackened by propaganda campaigns in Soviet Kyrgyzstan. His solace was music of his homeland, lilting melodies played on the Kyrgyz three-string guitar, the komuz, and Aitmatov's stories, which formed part of his collection of 5,000, 6,000 books on Central Asia in his personal library in Queens, New York. So about that meeting in 1975, in the 1970s, when the two men's lives intersected for the first time. Now, this is the Cold War. Altai is persona non grata in the Soviet Union. The KGB is alive and strong. And here's a picture of these two men meeting in Altai's apartment in Queens, New York. So that's the American angle to the book. During a period of warming in U.S.-Soviet relations in the 1970s, when space cooperation between the countries started and cultural exchanges took place, we all call that détente, we called it détente, Aitmatov got invited to the U.S. for the performance of a play he had written about Stalinism and the scars it had left on the Kyrgyz people. As a big fan of Aitmatov's works, Altai played an instrumental role in Aitmatov getting invited by the U.S. State Department. He was very helpful in getting the visa. The two men met in Aitmatov's New York hotel room on the very day that Soviet and American astronauts shook hands in space during the Apollo-Soyuz hookup. You can't make that stuff up. And I just want to read a passage from the book. The scene was an uncanny terrestrial version of the dramatic events that had happened earlier in the day. At noon New York time, Apollo had achieved a firm link-up with Soyuz over the Atlantic Ocean, 620 miles west of Portugal, in a culmination of 3 years of joint work by the Cold War rivals. Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov welcomed American astronaut Tom Stafford through the hatches with a hearty handshake. President Ford and General Secretary Brezhnev sent congratulatory messages to the crews. In Aitmatov's hotel that evening, 620 miles lower, a celebratory atmosphere prevailed, but of a far different nature. The impromptu gathering of Kyrgyz in New York, though unpublicized, had as much significance for the Kyrgyz people as did the Apollo-Soyuz handshake, maybe even more. It represented a coming together of the disparate parts of the Kyrgyz elite, two leading cultural lights of Soviet Kyrgyz in the same room with the founding voice of the Kyrgyz service of America's Radio Liberty, a Kyrgyz Hall of Fame, if you will. What unified them was blood and the simple joy of connection that stood as an affirmation that the Kyrgyz people were living, existing, and staying together, even across ideological divides that seemed insurmountable to so many, the day's events notwithstanding. In 1979, Altai returned to Radio Liberty in Munich and headed the Kyrgyz service. He arrived in time to chronicle the demise of his archenemy, the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union stumbled into Afghanistan in the 1980s, Aitmatov's prose got stronger. Aitmatov was widely published in the USSR and around the world in 160 languages. But his public statements often sang the praises of the Soviet system. That was the price of Aitmatov's inner freedom to write his mind, to write his conscience. Freedom inside had to be purchased with compromise on the outside. With the advent of perestroika, the two men, Azamat Altai and Chingiz Aitmatov, met more frequently, with Aitmatov brushing aside the increasingly powerless KGB. Aitmatov was appointed a member of Gorbachev's reform team and spoke openly about failures of the Soviet system during perestroika and the importance of restoring the place of language, history, and culture for the Kyrgyz and other constituent republics of the USSR. This photo, likely from 1989, shows a relaxed gathering in Munich, Kyrgyz style, with Aitmatov, the honored guest, getting the head of the lamb. Altai, the oldest at the table, is seated to Aitmatov's left. But one meeting in particular symbolized the new era, a time of hope and ultimately redemption. Aitmatov was in Munich presenting his latest book. Unbeknownst to him, Altai and other Kyrgyz working at Radio Liberty were in the audience. The KGB, in an effort to avoid a meeting between the two men, hustled Aitmatov and his wife Maria out of the hall and into a waiting car. A James Bond-like car chase ensued. So this is from the book. When the car carrying the Aitmatovs arrived at their hotel, a white van pulled up right behind. Out stepped Azamat Altai with several Kyrgyz adults and children. The wary KGB agents rushed to block their approach, but Aitmatov halted them. "These are my people. Let me speak with them," he said. Aitmatov's simple gesture spoke volumes. It said, "That's enough." Excuse me. And with his command to the two KGB officers, fear and silence, ingrained in the Kyrgyz people for decades and carried by Aitmatov himself, started to recede. It was as if Aitmatov were saying it was time to learn how to live in a normal society. No more keeping silent, no more fear, and no more tragedies. Yes, the fatherless Aitmatov seemed to be saying, let the next generation of Kyrgyz grow up with their fathers, and let the KGB learn another way to carry out its work. So this is a fun picture. Altai returned to Kyrgyzstan in 1995 after a 55-year absence. His criminal sentence was abolished, and he was greeted like a hero in independent Kyrgyzstan. When he stepped off the plane onto the tarmac, he kissed the ground. There to meet him was Chingiz Aitmatov. So you can see here, Altai is under the orange arrow. Chingiz Aitmatov is under the blue, and under the green is Chingiz Aitmatov's son, Askar, who was a Kyrgyz diplomat in New York at the time, and Askar got Azamat Altai the visa, and Askar accompanied Azamat Altai all the way back to Kyrgyzstan at a time when there weren't, you had to go through Tashkent and wait hours and hours and hours. So it's really kind of neat that the Aitmatovs were on both sides taking care of Altai. So what are the lessons from their lives? The individual counts. Freedom of thought, speech, and religion are the foundations of a democratic society. And take nothing for granted. Nothing is guaranteed. Dedicate yourself to what you believe in, structure your life to achieve it, base decisions upon it, and yes, be ready to make compromises to achieve the larger goal. And, in the case of Azamat Altai, be ready to lose precious things along the way. The moral arc of history bends towards justice, Martin Luther King said. Both men, Azamat Altai and Chingiz Aitmatov, found justice in their lifetimes, and that's the redemption in the title. So Altai's redemption, we could see, was returning to Kyrgyzstan, and as we saw in that wonderful film, being greeted like a hero by his fellow countrymen and women. A few years earlier, Aitmatov himself, before Altai's return, Aitmatov himself, after decades of looking, found his father. Turakul Aitmatov was at the bottom of a grave with 137 other skeletons piled on top, all victims of Stalin's purges. Dry conditions in the mass grave, which had been a brick kiln, had preserved the written order sentencing Turakul Aitmatov, his father, Chingiz's, to death. The excavation of the mass grave captivated Soviet Kyrgyzia during the summer of 1991. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a video here. So this is a video that was taken by the people who were excavating the grave and pulling out these skulls, 137, pulling out personal objects that were preserved in the climate, this warm climate. These are shoes. This is the brick kiln that became the burial ground. Here are other artifacts. This all happened in July of 1991, 6 months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Here you can see in his cowpack the workers digging. And here they're pulling out the letters. These are the sentencing documents that were preserved that had the names of the people who were executed. And then they were able to match the bodies to the people, and they were able to tell relatives who had waited 53 years that they had found the remains of their fathers, brothers, husbands. So that gives you a sense. Aitmatov himself gave voice to the miracle. So this is from the book. This is a quote from Chingiz Aitmatov. Everything disappeared, disintegrated. The bodies of the unfortunate people, their shoes, clothes, Aitmatov would say a few weeks later, except this paper, this document from that era with the name of Turakul Aitmatov, which remained intact enough to read. Dry conditions had preserved the documents, but the Aitmatov family knew that something else was at work in solving the gruesome mystery, and so did many other Kyrgyz. There is in the world some higher justice, timeless and absolute, Aitmatov said, something maybe beyond our everyday existence. Loss, redemption, and hope, a true story of the Cold War from Central Asia. Do you want me to stay here?
Thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation. We've all been so inspired by all of this. We do have time for a couple of questions, so if someone has a question, please go ahead.
I didn't ask you this, Jeff, but how did you come to decide to write about two, both of them are worth of their own books and stories, but it was very interesting to read how you managed to really tell the stories of two great men in one book.
I initially wanted to write a biography of Aitmatov because I really liked his writing, and I thought that this is a writer that actually Americans should know about. So that was the original idea, and I didn't find any biography of Aitmatov in English, and so that's what I started out for 3 years doing, and then I was interviewing Tinchtibek Choretegin from Radio Liberty, and I was interviewing him about Aitmatov, and he mentioned Altai. And I had never heard of Altai's name the whole time I was in Kyrgyzstan for 3 years. And he told me a little about him, and I just thought, wow, that's a pretty interesting story too. And he was outside, Aitmatov was inside, and I didn't know what I would find, but it would be more interesting. It was just a more interesting story to me at that point. And as you as a former journalist, you know, good stories are important, and weaving it. So I just then decided to weave them. And then as I said the other day, I think a writer, you have to be lucky too. And I was lucky because I didn't know that they had met in New York in 1975. I mean, I think Chinch had said that, but then I found a letter, courtesy of Venera, that Altai wrote to a friend after he just met Aitmatov, and you realize what an important meeting that was for him. The photos were there, and then people were still alive, and I could get the story. Yes, Mary Jane.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask you, you had this lovely picture with all the siblings. What happened to the siblings?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, as was mentioned in the film, Aitmatov lost a lot of cousins and family members, 3 uncles, and I can't even remember, and his father to the purges. Of his own family, there were 4 kids. Chingiz was the oldest. And Ilgiz was second, and Ilgiz was a scientist, a geologist. He's still alive. He was head of the Academy of Sciences. He was, worked in the geological mining industry. I think, I'm not quite sure, but he is about 80. He must be 87 or something now. Chingiz would be 90, so he's 2 years younger. 88, distinguished man. And then Rosa is alive and well in Bishkek, and she was the youngest, and she was 9 months old when her father disappeared. never knew her father. She's written a bunch of good books, which have been very helpful about the family history. So she's alive and well, and was she was trained as a teacher and very active in NGO work for many years after independence. And then, actually, Rosa's youngest, Lucia, was the third. And Lucia was went to the Polytechnical Institute and got a degree, I can't remember, in engineering. She died relatively young, I think in the mid-70s. But she was born as a twin. And there was a boy and a girl. Lucia was born. And the boy's name was Revo, and her name was Lucia. So when you put it together, it's Revolucia, which shows you how their parents were such committed communists to the cause, and yet the father gets purged. You know, it's insanity. So she passed away, but she has a son, a couple of kids, and he is a writer, and he's written some interesting works about the legacy of his uncle. Rosa remained, Ilgiz remained, yes, and yeah, that's right.
I know you, Jeff, thank you very much for your book, for Kyrgyz nation. After I read your book, I cried, really cried. Please permit me to cry to my people. And I wrote on Facebook, what's wrong with us? Kyrgyz people had to write this book. We had to research our greatest writer, Aitmatov's life, because we have stories which were not known, unknown, still untold. How he was treated by his religious friends, etc. So thank you very much for your great work. And I want to ask how many people you met to write this book, because we did an incredible amount of work. And you have already feedback from English-speaking audience. So far I'm hearing from
Right.
English-speaking.
I mean, I think, I don't know, I probably did 30, 40 interviews around the world, Europe, US, Kyrgyzstan. In terms of feedback, good feedback. I was very gratified to get an email the other day from the former president of Norton Publishing and the former chairman emeritus of the Yale University Press, one man, who was very helpful to me during the attempt to find a publisher, because I didn't write this book having a publisher saying, Jeff, we're gonna publish this book. So it was, I had to go out and market it. And as they say, you only need one person to say yes, but a lot do say no. His name is, well, it's not important, but he said something to the effect of history told at its best, narrative, scope, pace. And that was really gratifying. I think, yeah, the other people I've talked to, I haven't been back to the States since it was published, I just got back 4 days ago, have found it to be a good read, a page turner, yeah, and educating them about a part of the world they may not have known much about. But I think the thing that I hope connects is that these are two human individuals, and it's actually a universal story that transcends geography or state borders. Yes?
I just wondered, Jeff, if you had any troubles along the way with your research, any obstacles or difficulties getting access.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I was pretty lucky. No, I was very lucky, and I think that's a testament to Kyrgyzstan being open. I had researchers on the ground because I wasn't in Kyrgyzstan for a lot of the time, and they were able to get everything, that we needed. But I made requests here as well, FOIA requests, and our bureaucracy is slow, but eventually I got a response. So actually, the research was pretty darn good, and I felt lucky about that. Yeah, I felt fortunate. Yeah.
Thank you very
you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.